So in important ways, the Labour Party used the war years to good effect, whereas the Liberals simply became a more faction-ridden group. And this brings me on to the third explanation for the Liberal decline, and that is the rise of the Labour Party as a viable challenger, as the party of the left. Now, in several ways it could be argued that this itself is also related to the First World War, and here we come to Matthew McKibben and Kay's franchise thesis. The First World War provided an important stimulus for the passing of the 1918 Representation of the People Act. There had been agitation for a Fourth Reform Act before the war, but the events of 1914 to 18 had accelerated the impetus for reform. Some of the young men who'd fought and died for their country on the Western Front had lacked the vote. This, it was argued, simply shouldn't be the case. And in fact, the residency qualification, pre-1918, meant that thousands of soldiers had been disqualified precisely because they'd spent the previous years in the trenches. So the historians Matthew McKibben and Kay argued that the major beneficiary of this reform was the Labour Party. And certainly the opening up of the vote to all men over the age of 21 in 1918, and also to all soldiers regardless of age, meant that a new swathe of the working class were enfranchised. Before 1918, only about 60% of working men held the parliamentary franchise, and of course no working women at all. Lodgers in unfurnished rooms, paupers, most members of the armed forces, and live-in servants were all, or had all been excluded. But their thesis can be challenged in two ways, and has been challenged by Dalton Tanner, for example. First, Tanner has shown that the people disenfranchised before 1918 were not just the working classes. Young, unmarried, mobile men could be middle class as often as they were working class. And in any case, 8.4 million, or nearly 2/3 of the new voters enfranchised in 1918 were women who came with different political attitudes. Secondly, Tanner has pointed out that the enfranchisement of 1918 hardly led to a major advance in Labour's standing. Yes, okay, they got 57 seats in 1918 compared to 42 in December 1910. And yes, okay, it's a difficult election to analyse because of the effect of the coupon election, which favoured the Conservatives. But it wasn't as successful an election as Labour had been hoping for. And actually, the working classes who made up the majority of the electorate simply didn't vote en masse for Labour after the war. Even after 1918, in an electorate dominated by the working class, Labour never managed to poll more than 37 to 38% of the vote between the wars. Which suggests that either there was no spectacular rise in class consciousness amongst the working classes, or that class consciousness didn't necessarily translate into a vote for Labour. So, how far would the Liberals have been challenged by the young Labour Party even without the Representation of the People Act? Well, firstly, one could argue that the working classes were becoming a more homogeneous bloc. One measure of this is the considerable expansion in trade unionism. The trade union movement had 2 million members in 1901. It boasted 4.1 million by 1913. And since Labour Party membership could only be held through trade union membership, then this itself accounts for the growth of the Labour Party. It also accounts for sudden growth spurts. So when the Miners' Union, the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, joined the Labour Party in 1909, the last major union to do so, it brought with it the affiliated membership of 600,000 people, and also, of course, a dozen MPs. By doing so, it lost them to the Liberals, who they previously supported. So trade unionism was on the rise even before the war, although one could argue that, again, the war accelerated these developments. Trade unionist numbers doubled, for example, again over the course of the war. So the working classes were more homogenous. But secondly, I was talking earlier about the development of new liberal ideas, which gave the Liberal Party a new lease of life in the early part of the century. In fact, here again, they increasingly found themselves challenged by Labour, both before and during the war. Whereas the traditional argument goes that the Labour Party was unable to distinguish itself ideologically from the Liberals, and that it was therefore unable to overtake it until the Liberal Party itself ran into trouble, it would be wrong to say that the Labour Party before the war was nothing more than an offshoot from Liberalism. It was hugely influenced by Liberalism, but it was also beginning to develop its own distinctive ethos. The call for a national minimum wage, for example, was a distinctive policy of the Labour Party. Nationalisation was also traditionally important to the Labour Party, and at annual Labour Party conferences, resolutions which called for the nationalisation of key industries were able to unite sometimes divided delegates. The war itself, incidentally, also gave strength to this area of Labour's appeal by demonstrating the benefits of state control. And there were other reasons as well why the Labour Party was different to the Liberals. The Labour Party was primarily a party of the working class. Liberalism wasn't about class. Even new liberalism wasn't about class politics. Its adherents were middle class or upper class, and the new Liberals generally confined their attacks to the super rich, as with Lloyd George's budget, or they advocated land reform, which hit hereditary landowners and their unearned increment, as the Liberals called it. And even new liberalism, therefore, didn't necessarily appease all working class voters. The wave of industrial action in the years immediately before the First World War brought to the fore new, younger trade unionists who had new ideas and were less wedded to the liberalism of their older colleagues. You can see this, for example, in the Coal Miners' Union, which was the biggest and most powerful union of the time. At both local and national level, there was a shift before and during World War I, as older men who'd grown up with and developed their political consciousness in a liberal world were replaced by younger men who sensed new possibilities within the Labour Party. As well as a different ideology, Labour also provided something else to the working man that the Liberals didn't, and that was representation. One of the key Liberal mistakes, as far as the organised workers were concerned, was the rejection of representation by men of their own social class. So yes, the Liberals might enact social reforms, but these were reforms enacted by the middle or upper classes on behalf of the workers. Even Lib Lab trade unionist MPs were not formally part of the Liberal Party. When Keir Hardie had been first elected as MP for West Ham in 1892, he'd had to stand as an independent Labour candidate because the Liberal constituency party had refused to support him. So, in conclusion, remember that inevitability is a dangerous word in history. It's easy in hindsight to represent the first half of the 20th century as the forward march of Labour, with Labour's inexorable rise culminating in Attlee's 1945 government, and with the Liberal decline therefore inevitable. But at least until 1913, the Liberals remained a vibrant party, with the Labour Party in their shadow. In 1906, Labour's sudden jump from 2 MPs to 30 had been the result of the secret electoral pact drawn up between the two parties in 1903, with Labour as very much the junior party. Even after the war, Labour remained dependent to a greater or lesser extent upon Liberal support, up to and indeed including 1924 and 1929. It didn't, at the time, appear that the Liberals had been fatally undermined. As a final thought to end, and I want to think of the counterfactual. What would have happened if Britain had never entered the war? Britain's involvement on the continent was far from a certainty after all, What would have happened if the Liberal government had decided to remain neutral, as many advocated at the time? Well, I think that the momentum would still have swung towards Labour, but it would have taken longer. Trade union membership growth would have been slower, perhaps the representation of the People Act would have been delayed. Above all, the huge rift in the Liberal Party would not have permitted Labour to take advantage of Liberal disarray when it did. But the Liberal government did, of course, decide to enter the war, and that meant that by 1918 the damage had been done. The interwar years were in fact to be controlled by neither party of the left, but by the Conservatives, who dominated government virtually continuously from 1918 to 1939. But relegated to third-party status, voters increasingly thought a Liberal vote a wasted one. If they wanted to vote for a progressive party, they voted for Labour. If they wanted to vote anti-socialist, which most of the population usually did in this period, then they voted for the Conservatives. I just want to sum up then. To what extent was the First World War responsible for the longer-term Liberal decline? In this lecture I've explored three main reasons for the Liberal decline. The first was the argument that the Liberals were in decline even before the war broke out, a contemporary argument. However, this has largely been rebutted by historians who argue that new liberalism had successfully rejuvenated the party, and the progressive measures of the Liberal government after 1906 are a good example of this. Secondly, I looked at the effects of war on the Liberal Party. Most importantly, the war created a huge rift between the supporters of Asquith and the supporters of Lloyd George, and it was a rift that would never really be healed. In the meantime, the Labour Party used the war years to their advantage, improving party organisation and benefiting from the growth of trade unionism. Finally, I looked at the rise of the Labour Party as a viable challenger and the main opposition party. The 1918 representation of the People Act was important here, although it's not a straightforward picture. The newly enfranchised working classes didn't automatically vote for Labour. But Labour was also increasing its appeal through the development of a distinctive political ethos and could present itself more persuasively as the party of the working classes. Here was a chance for working class men and women to actively represent themselves in government, something that the Liberal Party could never offer them. And all of this meant that when, after 1939, another war again comprehensively reshaped the political landscape of Britain, this time the Liberals were nowhere to be seen, and it was Labour that again became the dynamic force in British politics.